welcome to Tommy's Game Table. My name's Tommy, and today we're going to be making dungeon tiles. Everything that we like to build is for a 28mm scale for this game. It's pretty easy because everything's on a 1-inch grid pattern. But because I grew up in Australia and we don't use the imperial system, we use the metric system, I actually just bought one of these mats and it's got inches already on there, so I'm not very good at maths, so that makes things a lot easier for me. Alright, so in my last episode we kind of briefly mentioned how we can make some basic stuff like this. We've got all different shapes and sizes, and it's all just made out of real basic sort of styrofoam that you'd get from your packaging from Amazon or wherever you get your appliances from and such like that. So for this build, all you're going to be needing is some styrofoam, just any kind of cut-offs you have, a straight edge or a square. We've got 3 different options. So basically we've got everything from Proxxon hot wire table, which I'll probably be using for most of my builds. If you haven't got one of those, you can pick up these sort of hot wire cutters on Amazon for like $20, $25. Comes with all of your attachments and everything. Absolute game changer, one of these for a very cheap investment. If you haven't got access to one of those, we can always use just a safety blade as well. All you're going to need is a little bit of Mod Podge or PVA. We're going to use some black paint, some grey paint, and some white paint. Keeping it real simple. And going to need just a cheap paintbrush. This kind of size will do, any size will do. A pen of some kind so you can sort of draw up and measure out your inch squares. Cup for some water. And I sometimes just like to use Tupperware lids. They can be a bit cheaper than using like a pallet or something like that. Alright, let's get into the build. So first of all, we're just going to get our straight edge here, and we're just going to mark out just some lines just to get rid of this sort of messy edge here. Now, we also, one thing I forgot to mention, is just a steel ruler. Put a decent amount of pressure on there, get your blade out. Just watch where your fingers are when you're doing this kind of stuff. Cool. And that's how you get a nice clean edge when you're using one of these bad boys. But again, it leaves a little bit of mess, which is the one thing that I don't like using a hobby knife. Alright, so another way that you can do this is I literally just got one for Christmas. Thank you so much to my beautiful wife for buying me one of these, because it's been a bit of a game changer. These kind of markers along these, which is 1-inch marks, makes the life nice and easy. So we're going to line that up in the corner. Let's do a 6x6. So we're going to make a little mark here, 6, a little mark, and then we grab our trusty straight edge and bang. Now while we're in here, we can always come through and just mark everything out while we're going. So what I usually like to do with this one is just put a little notch, every 1-inch interval. And then come through with our straight edge again. So again, making sure everything's nice and squared up, nice and plumb, nice and flush. That one thing going to be mindful of is this pen width is pretty thick. It's all good because we're going to paint over all this stuff. So even if you make some mistakes, it's totally fine. We're going to be painting over all of this jars. It doesn't have to be super precise. If you get it pretty damn close, that's the main thing, because we're going to be making this look pretty aged and pretty sort of war-torn and battle-torn. Sometimes I'll come through and just mark those edges. You can see here, that's beautiful. Alrighty, now that we've got that all sorted, welcome back our good friend Proxxon. Hey buddy. Cool thing is too, you can line everything up perfectly before you actually start making your cut. Turn it off. Now we've accidentally just made a bit of a whoopsie and got a bit of a hole into our dungeon tile, but that's okay. We work with these things. That's going to be a happy little accident. There you have a nice dungeon tile, minus the bite out of it. But that's okay, we can work with all of these things. Okay, for this next little bit, what we're going to be working on is making this stuff a little bit more defined. So I'm going to come back through with our pen, and just like we've done around these sides here, we're just going to line it all up, just so we know what we're working with on every side. They've probably been aged and withering away for thousands of years, so if there's a little bit of crudeness to them, it's expected. Alrighty, so now we're going to go ahead and grab our handheld cutter. Again, you can do this with a knife. You can see on that first sort of run that we did the reasons why I don't usually like to use a knife and why I prefer to use things like hot wire cutters. And if you don't have access to one of these, and again you don't have Amazon or anything like that, you can also use like a soldering iron, a hot wood burner. I've used all those things before I discovered this. They're all actually more expensive. They're probably more accessible. But when I found this on Amazon, again, it was just a game changer. And sometimes I even like to just start with the sides. It gives you a bit of a gauge on how it's heating up. Might need a little bit longer. So what you can see, we're going to come through and just lightly touch all of these edges. Now, I've got a window open. It's always good to make sure you've got well ventilated area if you're cutting foam with a hot wire. Same's true for if you're doing any painting or anything like that. Make sure you've got some good ventilation wherever you've got your hobbies set up. And honestly, I should be wearing a mask, but it'll be harder for you to understand what I'm saying. So, I'm gonna risk my life for your enjoyment. This slightly smaller one. You know, this little sort of crack thing has actually worked out pretty cool. I'm gonna work with that and make it part of a bit of a feature. We might even add some little cracks and stuff with our paintwork afterwards. See, it's always good to try and turn these accidents into something that looks like it's meant to be like that. We're just tracing along these lines. Don't worry if you've got a bit of a shake, that's totally fine. Again, dungeon tiles. Rushing through it because I don't want it to look too neat. Beautiful. And you can already see the dungeon tiles starting to come together. Boom, and there you have it. So that's basically most of the dungeon tiles sort of laid out for the most part. You could paint that straight up and that'll look really, really cool and it'll make the game table look awesome. But just because we want to step it up that little bit more, and you've come here to learn some stuff. Super handy tool that everybody should be able to gain access to. It's a rolled up piece of aluminium foil. And we're just going to be rolling it across, and this just gives a little bit of texture and stops it from looking too much like styrofoam and makes it look a little bit more like rubble. You can turn it on its side, get a little bit of that texture through there. You can buy rollers and stuff that do the same thing, but again, everybody's got access to a little bit of garbage. You know, wait until your neighbours have some takeaway and then go and raid their recycling bin. Actually, maybe don't do that, I think that's illegal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is ready for paint. Beautiful. Alright, so now we're ready to paint. So we've got our basic dungeon tile, and this is something that I'd recommend doing for pretty much anything that you build out of styrofoam or anything that's a little bit more of a brittle or easily damaged kind of product, is you just want to mix up a little bit of black paint and Mod Podge, or whatever coloured paint you want as your undercoat, and a bit of Mod Podge. Mod Podge just helps strengthen it all up and make it a little bit harder. Everybody does this. This is just some awesome little tip that you find out once you've been doing it for a little while. So I just recommend always keeping a bit of a container handy that you just mix up this stuff in, because you use it for nearly every single build that you do. And it's almost like 50-50, roughly. I never measure anything out for this. So just go black paint, a bit of Mod Podge. You can also use PVA glue, and again, about 50-50. Grab your brush, mix all that stuff up, your dark grey or black glue-like substance. And once you've got that like that, you can be pretty savage with this. You want to cover the whole thing. So get that stuff in all the cracks, all the nooks and crannies. And again, I'm not being super neat with this. This is just trying to get this stuff on there to harden it all up. The advantage of using a Mod Podge and paint mix is you've got your hardening, you've got your undercoat, and your primer pretty much all sorted in one foul swoop. And you can see why I wasn't too worried about getting it too neat with all those lines, because everything gets covered up with this stuff. Spin it around, hit it from all angles. It's probably the biggest sort of gripe for anybody doing this, is waiting for things to dry. Doing the sides. Sometimes I'll even just paint a little bit of just the inside, just in case you want to use something that's a little bit elevated and you can see a little bit underneath. See that little bit that my finger's left? That's alright, let's paint over it. Now we wait for that to dry. Now we can move on to doing a bit of painting. So we want to have a little bit of grey paint and a little bit of black paint. So we're going to put a little bit of that in there. And only use cheap acrylics. You don't have to go out and use like your really expensive hobby paints for doing this kind of terrain stuff, because you'll find you just use so much of this. And if you're spending all that money on Vallejo or, you know, any of those bigger brands, it would just be way too expensive. All right, and now we're gonna do what's called a dry brushing technique. So it's basically when you try and get most of the paint off the brush, you just wanna be brushing it across the top of this. See, it's not really picking up all that darker stuff that we've done with the Mod Podge in black. Honestly, my brush is still a little bit wet. You want to do this with a dry brush, usually hence the name dry brushing. You don't want to completely fill it in. You want to leave a little bit of that black popping through. And it's always good to do these things in bulk, because you can see I've still got a fair bit of paint there. You can use what's called a wet palette, which I'm looking at investing in soon. It just stops your paint from drying out too much, because you always end up using way too much paint. Always check all your sides, because I nearly just missed one, and it's amazing how often that happens. So that's basically what we're looking at. I'm going to start stepping up these color tones and stuff and start really adding in some more and more detail. We're going to let that one dry for just a little bit. And then we're going to move on to a little bit of a lighter color. Now, another great little hack, if you're a little bit impatient like myself, is you can just get a very cheap blow dryer, hair dryer. Make sure it's not too hot, not blowing it too fast. You just want to have it on the lowest setting of heat and lowest setting of speed. So with these cheap ones, it's just got 1 and 2. So I just put it on 1 and just give it a little bit of distance. Beautiful. It's always good to have a few brushes on standby, just because you never know when you're going to need a nice dry fresh one. So we're going to use a little bit of this grey that we had from before, because we try not waste too much here. I'm going to throw a little bit of white paint in there. And the grey is actually a cement colour, so it's got this slight brown pigment to it, which I don't mind. And again, we're just using this more like a highlight. You want it to get on the corners and the edges. And again, this is just the super basic version of your dungeon tile. You can step it up to using XPS foam if you want it to be a little bit more detailed and less of that sort of circular styrofoam look to it. But again, if you just want to jazz up your game table a little tiny bit, this works so well. And you've seen how quick it is to do as well. You can make a batch of these in an afternoon while you're just watching some YouTube or chilling out, doing whatever you do. Just want to mainly get these corners, because that's what really makes it pop. It gives it a little bit of realism. Beautiful. And you can see all those different variations in the grey now. It just looks that little bit more popping. So we're going to dry that off a little tiny bit and move on to just a slightly bit lighter tone again. Now for this last bit, we're moving on to almost just straight up white. Here's a tiny bit of whatever's left over on our brush there. And this is such a light highlight, so you want most of that off of your brush. I think especially on the corners, it just makes it all pop real nicely. Makes it look more like slate, more like real stone. I don't know who originally invented dry brushing as a technique. I'm sure it's been around for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. The first person to show me was my old brother Sam. When we were painting Warhammer when we were younger, he would always show me how to dry brush things to make it look a little bit more detailed for, let's face it, a pretty minimal effort. But just before we do our wash, there's one thing, this is optional. I like to just grab a little bit of brown, a bit of white and brown. And this is, again, just to break up a bit of that grey. I want to give it a bit of aging, and like the dust has kind of been settling on it for many years. You can see that's already starting to just liven it up a little tiny bit, a little bit on the edges. Not overthinking it, just slapping it on wherever you think it's appropriate to have a little bit of brown. Alright, now we're going to grab ourselves a wash. I'm just going to be using one of the Vallejo game washers. It's probably not the most cost-effective way of doing this, but I will look at making my own washers very soon, because I'm realizing that I use it on just about every single project. And again, if you're buying this stuff at like the really nice sort of premium hobby paint brands like Vallejo and stuff like that, it can start adding up. And just with that brush from before, just pretty hectic with it. You want to pour it, slather it all over it. Because with these washes, what will happen is it'll seep into all the cracks and stuff like that, give it more depth. And again, don't forget to do the sides. And it looks pretty dark at first. You're gonna get a little bit scared when you do it the first time, but don't you worry, it's gonna look sick once it all dries. And this, again, it's just a really great project. If you're just getting into this for the first time, you're literally painting just a flat surface with some squares on it, so you can't really stuff it up. It's just about having fun, getting used to the feeling of a paintbrush in your hand, getting used to working with colors and paints and stuff like that. So again, this is sort of where you're gonna be ending up now, and you just wanna let that one dry. Again, a lot of this hobby is waiting for stuff to dry. And remember our little happy accident from before? I think it's actually turned out really sick. I'd even just leave it like that, but I've decided just to go a little bit further with it. Super fine tipped paintbrush, and I'm just going to draw on a couple of little cracks. Make it look a little bit more purposeful. Again, don't have to do this. This is just something that kind of happened halfway along the build. So I thought, hey, why not give it a go? Roll with the punches. It's nothing too major, nothing to write home about, but just add a little tiny bit of detail. And even if nobody sees it, but I know it's there, it's still worthwhile, because that's making the most of a happy accident. So now that I've got that pretty much dry, I'm going to be taking it outside and just giving it a little bit of a once over with a satin clear varnish, or you can use a matte varnish, works even better. I've just had a bunch of this stuff laying around, so I'm just using up whatever I've got. It's really not a big deal on which one you're going to be using. Some people even like a glossier finish on their projects, so feel free to use a gloss if you like gloss. I just prefer more of a matte kind of look. And the one thing you want to remember when you're spray painting with foam is a lot of people just don't want to do it at all because it is scary. It can ruin your whole project. It can make it really bubbly. Just do it outside. Make sure you're like a good foot or so away, maybe even 2 feet away from your project, and just light mists. Just do more coats with light mists. Don't try and get up close and soak it with it because it'll end up just melting all your styrofoam. So you can use this kind of stuff. Just be very careful. Alright, so there you have it. That's how you make dungeon tiles. So super quick and easy project that you can do if you're just starting out in this hobby and you want to just sort of get a bit creative and get used to how it's like to build this kind of terrain. This is just a great place to start. And I can add it to my heaps of other dungeon tiles. Now, if you liked any of this, I'd love for you to subscribe, share with your friends, like the video if it helped out in any kind of way. I know there's heaps of videos out there on YouTube, so thank you so much for clicking on this one and have an awesome day. Cheers. Yo, welcome to my channel. Hello and welcome to Tomi's videos out there on YouTube, so thanks so much for clicking.